Welcome to the podcast. It's dedicated to making you a faster cyclist. The Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee. We have TrainerRoad and Cannondale's Amber Pierce.
Hello.
And we have Pivot Cycles and DT Swiss's Hannah Otto. And I've been calling you Hannah Finchamp, and I should be calling you Hannah Otto because you've changed your name since you've been married. Hannah, it's good to have you on here.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So we are going to talk about amateurs versus pros in terms of training, whether we should train like pros, how pros train, whether athletes like Wout van Aert, Mathieu van der Poel, Tom Pidcock train in a very unique way that makes them so dominant. We'll cover all that. We'll also cover aerobic versus anaerobic training, the crossover benefits and different power zones that you get from training in different zones. And then we're also going to go over plenty of like pro tips, particularly from Hannah on this one about like bike setup and lots of stuff. It's going to be a good episode. I'm looking forward to it. But before we do any of that, Hannah, I want to talk, or actually first, podcast listeners, you submitted incredible questions this week and it was awesome. You can do that at trainerroad.com/podcast. We had so many of them. I have a lot of them earmarked for next week because they were so great, but we have a jam-packed, awesome episode this week and it's all thanks to your questions. So if you have questions about how to train, how to execute on a race day or in your workouts, something, I guess, analogous or adjacent to training, in the sense of like nutrition, recovery, anything else, send it to trainerroad.com/podcast. It'd be huge. Of course, the biggest thing you can do for this podcast to help us out and to help out TrainerRoad is to share this with other people. If you share it, that's huge. We're a bootstrapped company. We don't have some sort of huge investment pile that we put into advertising. So that's how we grow. So if you appreciate this, that would be awesome to help us out. Hannah, I want to talk to you because you just got back from Puerto Rico, or PR, I'm going to say, because people will get mad at me for saying it like that. You raced XCO and short track. Is that correct?
2 XCOs and 1 short track. Mm-hmm.
And that was over the period of 2 weeks?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool. And these are UCI races too. So it's not like some local race, right?
Correct. They're both C1s.
Okay, cool. So that's like, so that's you getting points too. So then you can get good call-up positions for your World Cup races that you'll do later on.
Exactly.
So I want to talk about what you learned from this. So did you start with XCO or start with short track? What was the order of races that happened?
Short track was on Friday. And then the first XCO was Sunday. And then I had another week. And the second XCO was the following Sunday.
And can you, what's short track for people that don't know on here? They may not know what short track is.
Short track is, you could think of it like a mini XCO, except the course should usually be less technical. It should be a small short circuit. So the laps anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes long, and you're going to race for 20 minutes plus 3 laps is usually what it is. So it comes out to be about a 25-minute race in the end. And it's often very tactical and it'll come down to the final laps.
So, and then you did 2 XCOs thereafter. Okay. So I want to we talked about first race. I think you were on that episode where we talked about first race expectations. What were your expectations going into these races? And hopefully this allows all of us to be a fly on the wall to see how Hannah does it, a pro. But what were your expectations of these races?
Yeah, I think this is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately because I've often struggled a lot with the first race of the season. You know, everything from just feeling like I had to pull myself up off of the ground after it because I was just so deflated, to, you know, literally crashing on the start line because I was so nervous that I forgot how to ride my bike. So for me, you know, the first race of the season carries a little bit of weight just because I've often struggled with it so much. So for me going into this race, a huge focus for me was just simply on limiting expectation and channeling a lot of what Amber says, like going in with curiosity and excitement, you know, like I just tried to stand on the start line with no expectation, and then recognizing in the middle of the race also, there's nowhere that I should be. Wherever I am is it. I shouldn't, it's not, oh, I should be on the podium. It's like, no, you're just wherever you are is where you're at. And I think that's a really important thing for everyone to remember in their first race this season, because, you know, especially in February, for most people, you shouldn't be at your peak. This certainly was not my goal race of the season. And so, you know, if I go into it with that expectation, I'm going to be disappointed. Instead, I have to go into it with the knowledge of I have so many ways I can still improve this year. And that is so exciting. So let's see the areas that I get to improve. And oh my gosh, if I improve them, where will I be at? So that was really my goal, was to use it as a barometer of where I can see the most improvement. And of course, I was there to get points. So the better I could do, the better it would be. But I can't control where anyone else is at in February, good for someone else if they're on great form. Also, I hope you can carry it all year. All I can do is worry about myself. And I know that, or at least I think that I'm in a really good spot. So that was kind of my mindset going into it.
Nice. And Maxine,
Awesome.
actually, our producer, Maxine, she's amazing. She actually has some photos of the race. So Maxine, if you want to put those up, you're welcome to. How did it go? What, let's talk about the result, but then fill us in on the other things that you were talking about in terms of, being where you're at and how your performance actually was instead of the outcome.
Yeah. So I was third in the short track, and then I was fourth in the first XCO, and then third again in the second XCO. So I was super happy. Like, that was for sure a great start for me. And, I felt like in the short track, it was really close. A lot of it was tactics. And so, it was kind of a fun, like, oh, darn, like I just was in the wrong spot at that final corner. And, that's racing. That's fun. In the first XCO, I felt like the heat just hit me so hard that was a little bit of a brutal experience. I came through the first lap and was like, oh my gosh, I feel great. And then the second lap, it just became so aware of how hot it was and felt like my head was going to explode. And just like started absolutely dumping water and stuff. So, but then I had almost a week and a half to heat adapt there. So the next weekend felt much more reasonable in terms of that. And, I finished third. So yeah, I was really happy with that. And I think, for me, some big takeaways were my start in all of the races. My starts were not excellent, but I came on really strong at the end. So that's both something to work on and something to celebrate. I think being in where we are in the season, it's really exciting to know that base training's paid off, and I felt super durable and strong in those final moments of the race. And I think the speed will come. The other thing that I feel like is now a big push for me is acknowledging that I have some work to do with my technical skills. Not even just huge features, just I felt like I was losing 1 second in every corner. And so I would close the gap on the climb and then lose 5 seconds on the descent, and then close the 5 seconds on the climb and then lose 5 seconds on the descent. It's a very unsustainable way to try and do a race. It's a lot of matches over and over. So, I think that's so fun though, because I learned that. And instead of being frustrated and angry, now I get to come back and say, oh my gosh, this is something I get to focus on and work on. And how exciting is it going to be to watch this progress all season long? So yeah, I feel good about it.
Great attitude. I love that. Right, Amber?
Yeah. No, it's super exciting.
Yeah. On the technical side of things, you switched bikes this year, which when you switch a bike, Amber had this on road bikes too. I'm sure also going to women's teams. And since Amber, you rode a bigger size than a lot of the other athletes, like you would need different components. This is like all par for the course. When you're a pro rider and you switch bikes, you have to change things up. Are you going to make any changes on your bike setup after, because there's one thing between riding it's one thing, but racing it kind of feels different. Are you going to make any changes with bike setup to help with the bike handling, or do you think it's pure technique?
That's a great question. I feel a lot stronger on this bike. I think the added suspension, and I really like the way it's set up too with the DW link. I just feel like it doesn't bob and it can handle big hits really well. So I'm
It's
super
the Pivot Mach 4 SL, right?
Yes, correct.
Sweet bike.
Yeah. So I'm super stoked on the bike. I think this is probably definitely a little bit more user. It's more, I feel that my issue is more how I'm reading the trail. I have a bigger tendency to just look at the corner for what it is. And then I can ride it in that way like, yeah, you come in, I got to slam on the brakes because it's really tight. And then look at how well I was able to get through this corner. Well, everyone else just made the corner super wide and didn't even touch their brakes. So I just need to kind of open my view of the course a little bit and get better at viewing the terrain. The one change that I think I might make is just to be able to run a little bit lower pressure. I'm going to try out some tire inserts, which could be fun. Yeah.
Yes. That is amazing. That is so good to hear.
Yeah.
Oh, it makes such a big difference. They're so good. I know
Awesome.
I'm saying that after breaking a wheel, but that's a different thing. We'll get into that. Actually, Maxine, I think you have a picture of my broken wheel and we didn't share it last week on the podcast. You can join us on YouTube, by the way, and see all this stuff. It's usually Thursdays at 8 a.m. Pacific on our YouTube channel. You should subscribe to our YouTube channel because we have tons of amazing content going up all the time and you can check it out. Maxine, do you want to show the picture of my wheel that exploded there at 24 hours in the Old Pueblo? And this, to be clear, was not a insert situation. Yeah, it's not straight. Wheels are supposed to be straight. So completely broken in two spots and then cracks elsewhere too. But that was a situation from hitting the actual outside of the rim, like a little rock that was like a rock arm that was sticking out, nicked the outside of the rim. And I heard it crack. And then I knew I had a really big compression, just like a couple of feet in front of me. I was like, if it's got a crack in it, it's probably going to explode. And it did. So thanks, Maxine. Yeah. So this is an interesting point about, and I call that like seeing the matrix when people, because and Amber's the same in road racing too, right? Where you can either be a fish in the school and you can just like do whatever everybody else is doing, or you can get outside of that and kind of see beyond and see that turn from a different perspective. Yeah.
And it makes a huge difference. Like, I think that's something that, in bike racing, we fitness, because that's what we, seemingly have to keep up on and train every day. But we have to train those technical abilities too, and that applies to the road as well. And because gosh, what would we do to gain 5 seconds on a climb? So much. I think all of us would like, tell me what to do and I will do it. But we're so quick to lose 1 second in every corner. And we have to, at least for me, I have to really change my mindset for that, because I go out and I tie myself uphill every day. But a lot of the time the downhill is just the fun part. It's just my husband says, were you weeing on that descent? Because he just thinks I go down and I'm like, wee. And in all reality, I probably am. Like, I really need to make that a big priority.
We did on our YouTube channel, there's a series where I did a Enduro World Series event, and Richie Rude came in to critique my lines. Awesome. And I had a GoPro on the whole time. And the things I was like, how was that? And he's so nice. He was like, yeah, that was good. And then I'd be like, okay, so what did you do there? Like, it would be totally different. But he would be seeing things that I just did not even see. Like to him, he doesn't view a rock as a thing to avoid. He views a rock as like another, if you will, like a medium or a substrate to ride upon. Like
an option. It's an option.
Yeah. He doesn't view it as a barrier. He doesn't view it as something that you need to go around. He's like, well, you might go around it if it's faster, or you might go over it if it's faster. Like for him, it's just what's faster. And he also, I mean, the incredible skill and strength that he has, he can pull off things that, even though I saw them thereafter, I was like, yeah, there's no way I would do that. Forget that. But it's really cool to watch the best athletes do that. And to be clear, I think even Richie struggles with that, probably, especially in the beginning of the year. Like, it's something that you really have to kind of like get into a rhythm with. So it's not just the fitness and execution part in terms of pacing or race strategy when you're on the gas, but it's also that descending part is just so important. It's really cool to hear you point that out. Yeah.
And I think, the pre-ride and acknowledging that every part of the course is equally important. I know in mountain biking, a lot of people, there's usually features in courses. And so a lot of people will sit on the feature and time themselves on the feature, trying to gain 1 second, on this feature that's anywhere from 20 to 25 seconds. And the corner after it, we might be losing 3. And so, I just love, some of people who have really impacted me in racing. It's like, there's no points for style. it doesn't matter if you can ride the hardest part of the course the best, if you're overall riding the course the fastest. And so just acknowledging that time is time, you know, and get it where you feel the most confident.
Yeah. I mean, you might be killing yourself to gain 5 seconds on the climb, whereas there might be 10 or 15 places on the course where you could gain a second each. 10, 15 seconds versus 5, right? And some of that is just free speed where you're not killing yourself to get it. It's just a matter of awareness and line choice.
Yeah,
just,
better line.
I say, not just. It's
better line and less
that's
breaks.
A whole, yeah.
Because that's like one, I've mentioned this on the podcast plenty of times. So I apologize, listeners, if this feels redundant, but it's something I have to remind myself of all the time. And it really helps is I start to think of the course. I think of the course in terms of linear feet. And I think, what is my speed per linear foot? On these feet that I'm carrying on the course, could my speed be 0.5 miles an hour faster? And what would I need to do to make that happen? I probably actually don't need to skid and follow that very clear path through the turn. Instead, I could actually just go wide and then go over all those little roots and leaves or whatever else that's in the center. It's when you start to think of it in that respect, that means that you quit focusing on one part of the course and neglecting the rest. And suddenly you start to just think of every linear foot. Okay, what do I need to do to carry more momentum here? And plot twist in your mind, the best way to get more momentum, particularly on a bike, isn't to jam harder into a turn. It isn't to brake later in many cases, although that can be a helpful thing. Instead, it's think of how much speed can I exit this corner with, and what's the best way to be able to manage or to maximize that, because otherwise you make up for that with watts. And when we're coming down on a race, if you're trying to make up speed out of every single corner and you add that up, I mean, imagine getting to the end of a sprint, right? You're sprinting against somebody and then think, oh, wait, actually give yourself about 150 more accelerations that you had to do throughout this race and then sprint. And then let's see how you do. You'll do worse. That's just how it works. So efficiency is so much a part of it, you know?
And I think what you just said is really great from a training standpoint too, because I think in a race scenario like that, a lot of people would get to the end, not win that sprint, and then say, oh, I'm not a good sprinter. Yeah. But it wasn't your sprinting at all. And so looking at the race as a whole is really important.
So true. If you're listening and you're wondering, how does anybody ever figure out how to see the matrix? To use Jonathan's analogy, this is a skill and it's something that you can learn. This isn't like a magic trick that, you know, some people magically can do and others can't. And what it takes is building cognitive efficiency. And I've talked about this a little bit before, but it's where when you're starting out, so take me, for example, I am not a skilled mountain biker and I'm very much on the steep end of the learning curve here. So when I get on the mountain bike, I'm thinking about all the little things. I'm thinking about my body position, you know, where my hands are on the bars. I'm thinking about, I have to think about so many things in addition to what line do I want to take? I'm not even looking at options. I'm looking at like 1 or 2 possible lines on the trail because there's so much information that my brain is having to process at once. But as I get better at that, what I will learn is how much of that information I don't actually have to pay attention to. And that's actually one of the biggest differences between an amateur and an expert is an expert is maybe focusing on 2 or 3% of the available information to their brain, right? Because they know that they don't have to think about 97% of it because that is, not going to be relevant to what they need. And so experts are actually really able to drill down on the very minimal, the minimum amount of information you need to make the best decisions. And that is something that you learn. And it's something that you get better at as I get more comfortable on the mountain bike and I don't have to think about hand position and that becomes automatic and habit. Then it frees up space in my brain to start evaluating the options on the trail. And then once I get better at that, my brain's going to say, well, I know I don't have to worry about these 7 options. The ones I really need to focus on are these 3. So don't feel like if you can't see the matrix right now, that this is out of reach for you. This is something, it's a process. It's a learning process, and it's available to all of us. It's just, it does take time. It's not something that you can jump in and do right away. That's what makes pros like Hannah so impressive. That it's, and to hear you talking about even just getting that next few percent is so cool. But yeah, this is it's a fun learning curve to get on, and it's something that anybody can do.
Yeah. And even as a pro, like, all of those things, it still clogs your brain. It really is. There's so much cognitive energy being spent out there. From when I acknowledged this limitation in the first weekend, I thought, okay, well, I have 1 week to try and hone in line choices, improve some small things, and we'll see if I can even make a small improvement in 1 week, just even a tiny amount. And I worked on all kinds of things that 1 week. But going into the race, I said, I'm going to think about 2 things on the descents. I'm not going to think about, these 10 things that I spent time working on all week. I'm going to work on leaning my bike, not my body. And I'm going to work on looking into the next turn, like looking ahead. And that was it. I didn't worry about the other 10 things that now I get to think about every day in training instead.
Who knew that we were going to be covering principles of information theory on the podcast today? It's awesome.
Exactly.
Check this out. This is really cool. And also, Amber's mentioned this plenty of times, and Hannah, I'm sure you've seen this also, but this doesn't just apply to mountain biking. It so applies to riding in a group too. It's whenever I get back into riding with groups again, after not doing it for a long time, and then I see riders that are really good at it, just like salmon their way through the pack, like seemingly like so effortlessly. I'm just like, how do they do that? And then fast forward a few weeks of doing it, and then suddenly I'm doing it. So it applies to all aspects, not just mountain biking. Super cool stuff. You mentioned the heat, Hannah. So, right now you're back in Salt Lake City. It's cold, and it's not hot. I don't know what your next races are. Are you going over to Europe for the World Cups, or to Brazil for that first one?
I won't be at Brazil. I'll be at Sea Otter. That'll be my next race.
And Sea Otter actually can be freezing, or it can be extremely hot. What's your plan for heat adaptation? Are you going to do anything in particular for that?
I haven't in the past, because I feel like for me, generally, my body likes heat. I sweat a lot. And so I feel like that actually benefits me. That said, I went into Puerto Rico with that mindset and quickly discovered that when it's that humid, it doesn't matter if you sweat, because you're not using evaporative cooling.
Sweating quits working.
So I think the humid heat is definitely very different than a dry heat. And so, if I were to go back to Puerto Rico next year, I might employ some heat strategies, even as simple as doing a couple trainer rides, easier rides without a fan or something like that. I don't think, if it was the national championship or something like that, then I would really put a ton of emphasis on it. But I think honestly, just at least for me, exposing my body enough that the panic button doesn't get hit is really all I need. So that when my body is like, oh my gosh, you're so hot, it's not like, what is this sensation? Instead, it just says, oh yeah, we've felt this before. It is uncomfortable, but we'll survive. Yeah. And that's something I can deal with.
That's a really cool perspective too. Even though it may be one thing that affects you at a race, be pragmatic about this. Like, is it going to affect you at your coming races? And is it worth your focus? Because there's so many things you can do. And if you try to focus on everything, it starts to hamper you, for sure. Super cool. Thanks, Hannah, for sharing. I love that we have pros out there racing and sharing their experiences on the podcast like this. Super cool. Let's get into Sam's question. So he says, would love, and by the way, I apologize all those who are from Belgium, from the Netherlands, everything else. I know I'm going to pronounce the names wrong. I apologize. If I tried to pronounce it better, it'll probably make it worse. So just bear with me. Sam said, would love to hear Amber or Coach Chad's take on this. So we have Amber. We also have Hannah as well. Cyclocross season just finished. And again, we saw the 3 roadies being Pidcock, Mathieu van der Poel, and Wout van Aert dominate. At times, they look like 3 pros who have joined an amateur race. Obviously, they are all genetic specimens and generational talents. And clearly, although it is interesting that we have three purely generational talents, like, generational talent is usually kind of stands alone, but I really do feel like we have three in those riders, three generational talents. We've had this on the women's side for quite a while, though, with like Anna van der Breggen, Mariana Vos, and like a lot of different athletes. So it's not unprecedented, but these three certainly are dominant. Yeah, so it makes sense. He says, and clearly they were on another level even before leaving full-time cyclocross for road careers. But it seems the road training and racing has only made them even more dominant at cyclocross. Ultimately, this boils down to, should everyone train just like the best roadies and only sprinkle in some discipline-specific skills here and there? I know pro riders in every discipline spend plenty of time on road bikes, but the training plans are still certainly very different. Thanks from Sam. And before we get into this is funny, Sam, because almost the same question was being asked before they jumped into road careers and they just started doing a handful of road races. Like when Van der Poel won Amstel Gold in that insane fashion that he did. And these riders are really starting to show up at road races and do damage. Everyone was saying, well, maybe the secret is that they train like cyclocross athletes and everybody should train like cyclocross athletes. And now looking at them road racing, going back to cyclocross, the question is maybe everyone should train like road racers. And maybe that's what makes them successful cyclocross athletes. So it's funny to see. It's a wonderful assumption to consider here, Sam, but it's funny to see how the tables have turned in that regard. Amber, what are your thoughts on this? Because this is something I'm sure that you've faced as a pro athlete coming from swimming in particular, where like you have this high level of fitness and then you come into this new sport. And you mentioned in the podcast we did with the Successful Athletes podcast episode where it was intimidating to come into this new sport and to be over to Europe pretty quickly in your cycling career and be surrounded by all these athletes. Were you tempted to just like, whatever they're doing, I want to do?
100%. And that was a lot of how I modeled the early part of my career. Was I would look at somebody who was successful and I would think, okay, if I just do what they do, I'll get the same outcome. And this is a very common misconception. And it's true to an extent. So it's an easy thing to fall into because we can look at it from the level of principles, and following the similar principles and applying those within specific contexts is one thing, and that can be really effective. But just modeling and doing the same thing that somebody else does doesn't guarantee you're going to get the same result. So we are all susceptible to this, and the proof is in the pudding, right? This is how most advertising works, right? You have a spokesperson and you think, oh, if I eat what they eat, I'll look like them. If I wear what they wear, I'll look like them. If I have the same haircut as they have, I'm sure most hairdressers get this. Like you walk in and you're like, I want this haircut. And they're like, yeah, even if I give you that haircut, you're still not going to look like a Scarlett Johansson, like it's just, so
I'll try,
I say that like as a joke, but it's illustrative that, just because somebody gets this outcome with this process doesn't mean it's going to work the same way for you. So I just want to put that out on the table first and foremost. It is, and just, keep your eyes peeled. This is how a lot of products get sold. Right. And it's a little bit frustrating, but when we find ourselves buying into it, but I think that if we kind of break this down and look at, what is it that really makes these athletes successful? Engines. They have massive engines. They've been building their engines year over year over year over year for
since
very,
they were
very
children
long time.
In these cases. Like,
yes,
like it was like junior world championships, and these three were racing each other. They've been training and doing this stuff for a really long time.
Right. And then handling skills. And there's a lot of crossover between cyclocross and road, but it doesn't all go both ways. And I can say that being a roadie, there are definitely road skills that do not apply in cyclocross. And I'm very aware of those limitations. And then there's also the race and tactical savvy. So the sheer experience that they have, you have to remember that it's not just about what training are they doing and how is that affecting their fitness. It's just considering the time horizon over which they've been able to learn, and they're still learning. Right? They are still learning and iterating and getting better. I mean, they are at the top of their sport. They're the best of the best. Even they are still learning about themselves as athletes, about race tactics, and being able to apply all that stuff on the fly. So they have this really, we can't discount the benefit of this very long time horizon, not only in terms of fitness, but also in terms of just, we were just talking about with Hannah, cognitive load, cognitive efficiency. Imagine the cognitive efficiency that these guys have built up over the years. It's amazing. And that alone is a huge advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to step back and think about this from like a basic principle standpoint too. If we, again, queen of analogies over here, so apologies.
I love
I'm just
it.
bringing
How we learn.
some really random
They're
ones in
fantastic.
today. If you were to go look at a Cubist painting by Picasso, for example, you might think, I could do that, you know? And if you went and tried to emulate that, it wouldn't be the same thing, because what went into Picasso's painting was 65 years of experience, many of which were dedicated to mastering the tools of the craft. And then once he had mastered the tools of the craft, he was able to, break all of those rules, wield those tools in completely new and creative ways. And that's what makes those works of art so priceless. And I think of these athletes in that way. They have spent the time building out the really basic tools, the really basic stuff, the basic handling skills, the basic fitness, building those things out. And now they have this massive tool chest that they can pull from and put together in really creative and new ways. So the idea that you could kind of jump in at the end and make what appears to be a Cubist painting and think that that's going to be on par with a Picasso is flawed, just because you're missing out on that long time horizon that went into what we see now. So the inputs, right? Like we're looking at the outputs and thinking and looking at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what we're assuming the inputs are. Is it road versus cyclocross? No, it's so much more than that. So trying to emulate the training that they are doing right now in this particular slice of time to get the outcomes that they're getting is missing the inputs that went into this over decades before now.
Yeah.
I'll jump off my soapbox now.
Those fantastic points. I want to look at what road training does for you, and then what cyclocross training does for you too. So, first of all, if there's a road race and it's just constant little punches all day, your training actually, in terms of your specialty phase or the specialized training that you do as you near your event, might actually look pretty similar. It'll be about hitting hard and repeating. So the road surface itself isn't inherent to specific types. It's really about the profile and how you plan to race the race. And that's how you train for it. So, but road training typically is going to have a whole lot more sustained efforts and sustained work, whereas cyclocross training is going to focus not even as much on like peak power and sprint, anything else. It's just repeatability. It's the ability to hit hard and then settle in, hit hard, settle in, and be able to do that over and over. The best cyclocross racers hit less hard than you think because they're so good at having a high. When I say settle back in, their settle in is very high and their speed is very high. So then as a result, they don't have to sprint as hard to get up that little hill. They can just kind of roll into it. And then they actually can even ease off the throttle. And they know that if they have less surges, it's going to help them. So even then, the top cyclocross athletes perform and train a bit differently than a lot of us amateurs have to perform and train as well. So that it's a bit complex there. Both of them still build, and this is definitely some foreshadowing for what we'll cover later. Both of them still are very much aerobic types of training. It's not like cyclocross is anaerobic and then road racing is just purely aerobic. No, they're both very aerobic. So it's not like just training repeatability is suddenly going to make you a fantastic athlete in one regard or a great road racer or a great cyclocross racer. There's a lot more to it. Just like any training plan, you have to have a balance of things. You have to be covering all sorts of energy systems that apply and build aerobic fitness. So it's not as easy as separating things. Now, what all of them have done is obviously when they were younger and just doing cyclocross, they didn't do as much big volume. And you probably saw even Mathieu van der Poel skipping a lot of longer races because like Milan-San Remo, I think he skipped that one. I could be wrong, 1 year early on in his road racing career because he was like, I'm not really ready for such long races like that. I haven't done a whole lot of it. And it's one thing to complete a long race, but when you're trying to be the best in the world of that long race, you have to be functional over that whole time period at an incredibly high level. So even then, once again, there's this decoupling between what he does to be at the pointy end of the field versus what we do just to finish, sort of a thing. So what I'm really getting at here, and sorry if I feel like I've just muddied the whole thing, but what I'm getting at is that they haven't just been like, okay, now road racing training, and I'm just going to do that and no more cyclocross training. They train themselves to be aerobically effective athletes and powerful athletes. And then they specialize as they need to be able to perform, just like you do. It's just at a different scale. So it's, maybe you already are kind of training like them, but that's kind of an interesting point that I want to cover, Hannah, is really like, just because they're training a certain way, is that giving them an advantage at the top level? And then should we do that? And when I say we, I'm not talking about you, Hannah. I'm not even really talking about Amber. I'm talking about all of us average people listening to this podcast. Just because the pros do it one way, should we train that way? What's your perspective as a pro athlete on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even if everything's equal, everyone's body and physiology is different. And so even if, Pidcock gave you his training plan and you did the exact same thing as him every single day, you still wouldn't become the same athlete. We all have to train different strengths and weaknesses. And even those of us who are finishing at the exact same, in a sprint finish, we've likely had very different training plans because our perceived strengths and weaknesses are different. And that's something I would emphasize in this question as well, is we don't know what these guys consider, in their heads to be their strengths and weaknesses. You don't know when they feel like they're on the rivet, or when they feel like they're making mistakes or falling short of their ultimate capabilities. And so we don't really know, what specifically they're targeting. We have a general idea, sure, of how they train, because you have to train certain ways to achieve certain things, but what they're emphasizing, it might be slightly different than you imagine. And so, to think that we should try and mimic something that we don't know is also a little bit comical, I think. But, and not even to get into the fact that most people couldn't emulate what they're doing simply because we don't have the amount of time.
Yes.
But yeah, I think also a lot of people would be surprised about how much crossover there is. So many mountain bikers spend their winters training like roadies. We spend so many long hours on the road bike. A lot of it would probably be crossover. A lot of base seasons, roadies and mountain bikers could probably train together. It's just these specialty phases. And so I would probably, guess that these guys are training with a foundation for all of these events very similarly, and then maybe just spending 6 to 12 weeks specializing for each of the disciplines.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That would make sense to me too. And it's a great point that you said. And it's even one of the complications of why studies that want to test different training methodologies are so problematic, is that Amber and I could be given the same exact training. And let's say, Amber and I are similar in height. We could eat the same things. We could do all that. She's going to get different value from the nutrition that we, even if it's the same thing, we are going to have different experiences. The training is the exact same way. We're going to have different experiences. That's why it's kind of hard on the study side of things to say, okay, so we gave training methodology A to 5 people and then B to a different 5 people. And then we did crossover double blind. It still doesn't mean much because everybody responds so uniquely. It's one of the reasons why we've been pushing so hard toward adaptive training, is to give each person kind of an individual approach to this, rather than just going off of something that's static. So,
well, and if there was one perfect approach, don't you think that people who have dedicated their lives to these sports would have all discovered it and all be doing it? That's why all professional athletes still have different training regimens, is because we are different people.
Yes,
exactly. And I think that that's a lot of people look to the pros and think, oh, they've figured it out. So if I just do what they do, then I can skip over all of that. But that misses the point that you just made, Hannah, which is even at that top level, each pro has their own individual approach. And it's, even if you're on the roadside, you'll have, in some cases, on a professional team, you'll have a performance director who is, maybe coaching all of the athletes on the team. They're not all doing the same thing. I guarantee it, because that performance director is having to coach up each of those athletes according to each athlete's individual needs. And it's all very different. So that might sound discouraging. Like, the pros all have it figured out for themselves. And you can't copy them because you won't get the same results. So what do you actually do? You just go back to the basics. You go back to the principles. This is all aerobic endurance training. You train according to those principles and within the constraints that you face in your own life, and you experiment and you see what works best for you. But you start with those principles, apply them the best you can, figure out what's working and what's not working. And then you just keep iterating for yourself. And so you end up doing what the pros do in a sense, because you just self-experiment and iterate and figure out what works for you. The end result may not look the same as what anybody else does, but that doesn't matter if it is in fact working for you.
Good ad for TrainerRoad, Amber. Way to go. That was solid. Principles are baked in. TrainerRoad.com. Go sign up. Share with your friends. Rose has a great question. Rose asks, hello, TrainerRoad crew. My question is regarding leg asymmetry, but perhaps not in the way you've likely been asked this question before. Instead of asking about pedaling power coming from the legs asymmetrically, I'm curious on your opinion about developing equal descending ability with either leg forward. So if you're listening to this right now, and hopefully not like driving a car or something, like think about which foot goes forward, and you absolutely have a dominant foot that goes forward. That could even be on the road bike. Typically on the road bike, you don't descend with your feet flat ever. You have one foot down because if you're going around a turn, you have your outside foot down, that sort of thing. But even then, if you're just to stand up on your road bike, you likely always do so with one foot forward. For me, my right foot goes forward. Hannah, how about you? Which foot do you have forward?
My left foot's forward.
And Amber?
My left foot's forward. I'm really excited about this question because I've been wondering the same thing myself.
I'm curious. I'm going to carry out a very scientific study right here. With skateboarding or snowboarding, are you goofy or regular footed? Surfing too?
Regular.
Meaning you're regular?
I would go with my left foot forward. I don't know what that's classified
as. So you'd be
regular.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm goofy. I'm goofy footed. So then I also have the other foot forward. So typically goes to like your dominant, or doesn't correlate to this, but people say your dominant leg off the bike often goes forward, but that isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes it's up to a whole lot of different things. But anyways, curious what team you're on. If you're in the chat right now, let us know if you're goofy or regular footed and which foot you have forward. So let's make a real scientific study out of this one. He says, I'm curious, or forgive me. Rose says, as I've been riding more and more, I'm lost. Now she says, I'm primarily a mountain biker. And like most, I have a strong preference for which leg is forward while descending. As I've been riding more and more, this preference has become more ingrained, to the point where I'm pretty sure the muscles of one leg are larger than the other. That's probably the case. My dominant leg is also the one that I have going forward, and that one is larger in circumference. Weird running things. I just had it measured. So that's the only reason why I would know such things. It says, I've heard that that you should develop descending skills with your non-dominant leg, but during long events, when I become fatigued, it becomes harder and harder to use the stance that feels awkward. For technical features or drops, it feels unsafe to use my non-dominant leg. That's very understandable, Rose. I think that we all agree that would feel very unsafe, especially if these features come up unexpectedly. For shorter events, it feels like developing this ambidextrousness wouldn't be worth the effort. So do I need to try to even out those leg muscles? Thank you so much for all that you do. Hannah, what do you think about this? Being the pro mountain biker here that descends, should we try to be even left and right foot forward?
I feel like there's so many elements to this question. It needs to be broken down a little bit. Cool. I think that, first of all, I feel like the question is stemming from leg strength. And I just probably wouldn't place that much power on descending unless you're descending for, an hour every day in this static position. I'm guessing that whatever leg asymmetry you have, it could be that your leg is fatiguing during the descent. Don't get me wrong. But if one leg is truly stronger than the other, I would guess it's from something else in your life that you might not even be aware of. It could be as simple as a dominant leg is a dominant leg for a reason. You're going to fall back on that leg. And so even just standing, most of us will lean onto one leg to the side. It could be as simple as something like that you're just always utilizing that leg. So from a strength aspect, if you're worried about one leg being stronger than the other, that's something I would focus on in the gym. I would put the emphasis on gaining symmetry off the bike rather than trying to equalize your strength when you're on the bike. From a skill standpoint, that becomes a different story. I think there's some validity in this. It certainly doesn't hurt in training every now and then to throw the other foot forward, just because, you might get caught out somewhere in a race. But like you said, worth the effort. That's what I start to think of. If you're spending most of your time descending with the wrong foot forward, you're not working on your descending in your strongest point. So this is something, maybe just throw it in once a ride. I wouldn't spend time focusing on this. Instead, I would spend time practicing how to get your dominant foot forward, because that actually is something that will be more applicable in a race. You don't ever want to go off a drop with your non-dominant foot forward. It is awkward and it is dangerous.
It's dangerous. Yeah.
It is straight up dangerous. And that's okay. It is for all of us. That's not a weakness in you. That's just how it is. And so I would focus on, spending time. It could even be in a parking lot. This is something we practice a lot actually with cornering. When you corner and the outside foot is down, getting your back foot down versus getting your front foot down is a different motion, because you have to turn the crank in a different manner. And so something as simple as a slalom drill, where you're having to quickly get one foot down over and over, is a great way to practice this, because it makes it become automatic to learn how to navigate your feet and making your feet go in the position that you want, rather than making your brain and body adapt to an uncomfortable position.
Yeah, and chances are, if you're not familiar with descending with one other foot forward, you're going to do a lot of weird compensations because you'll lack coordination in that position. You'll do a lot of weird compensations with your upper body, like upstream of that. And that could put you into spots where you're doing things. It's almost like riding that backwards bicycle. I don't know if you've seen that, the YouTube videos that exist where you turn the bars one direction and it goes another way. It's kind of like riding the rollers. In those situations, and you feel that uncoordinated and kind of just like the world's been flipped upside down, you make bad decisions, even though you feel like all your intuition will lead you to make bad decisions because it's patterned in a totally different platform. So it's really dangerous. I can only think of a couple times in a race where I've had to descend with my other foot forward. It's typically because I get bumped by another rider, or I'm like caught up with another rider and that leg got pulled back by their handlebars or something like that. Really weird. And even then, I instantly, as soon as I'm able, my feet go backwards, they rotate backwards, so then I can get my dominant foot forward, because that's where I'm best. And there shouldn't be a situation where you would actually be forced to ride with your non-dominant leg forward ever. Even a mechanical situation, there shouldn't be one that would, for some reason, force you to ride with that foot forward. So it's likely not like even an insurance plan that you would never need to do. I've asked Keegan Swenson, and then I just asked Richie Rude too. So world champion and national champions here. Keegan says, sometimes I end up there and I can do it and it's fine, but no, I never practice that. No way. And then Richie says, I'll do it from time to time just because you might end up in that situation. And sometimes it's good to try to feel a bit more equal side to side, but it sounds like he hardly does it. Also, Richie does things on bikes that none of us can do. So that's like, once again, going back to the pros doing something and us doing something else. But Amber, what comes to mind with this is this could also be a distant cousin to dropping your foot, that outside foot in the turn. Because I've noticed with some newer athletes, it's tougher to drop one foot down than the other foot when they go through a turn. Have you seen that too?
Absolutely. And I personally have a preference, like going through a right-handed turn with my left foot out is a lot more comfortable for me than doing the opposite. But in road cycling, you don't have a choice. If you're taking a left turn, it needs to be your right foot down. You don't get to say like, oh, I'm going to put my preferred foot forward. Because then you get into some real mess and it's not pretty. So in that case, you do really need to practice, but you naturally get that practice because it's just going to come up in the course of every single ride that you do. And I know this is similar for ski racers. I think if you're a slalom racer, right, you're having to turn in both directions with weights on either leg, but you may still have a preference. But you, in this case, really do have to train both sides. You don't just get to make left turns on a ski hill or on a road bike.
Yeah. And like you've said, put all your darn weight on that outside leg. It's so important in road racing and in mountain biking. Where it changes in mountain biking, right hand is when you have a berm that is going to allow you to not have to put all that weight down there to dig in and get that traction. If your berm is kind of like supporting you. So even though it feels like you're leaning over, you're actually just perpendicular to the road surface. Right. So
yeah, I think of the berm more as it almost becomes more flat again, because if you just turn it on its side, you're flat.
Yeah. If you're hooked to the road perpendicular, when you rotate the road, that you're just matching that pitch. Right. So but this is a really interesting question. I bet one that I bet a lot of you have had this question, but you haven't vocalized it before. So I'm glad this podcast is a spot where we can ask those sort of questions and discuss them. So Rose, I would not stress over it, certainly just because of the danger that could exist with this in terms of training. So yeah, I think that it's something there. Now, two more bits of info. Richie says, I think it is something to consider for sure. So for what it's worth, there we go from a world champion saying that it's something to consider. Keegan also says, he says I'm ambidextrous. Maybe Keegan doesn't even know if he's left or right footed. I would not be surprised. So in that case, never mind. I didn't even mention their advice. But thanks guys for chiming in live on this. Good to have you guys. Okay, let's go into Brad's question. He says, first off, I love the app, podcast, and adaptive training, and 5 stars all around. Thank you, Brad. If you're listening to this, go to Spotify and you can listen to the podcast on Spotify, which is awesome, by the way, which means that if you have Spotify apps on your TV or anything else, that means that you can have the podcast there. I really recommend listening to the podcast on Spotify. It's awesome. There's also timestamps that are linked in the podcast. We can't link those timestamps in other podcast apps, but in Spotify we can. So basically, if you scroll down in the description, you'll be able to tap where it says at 3 minutes and 14 seconds, we talk about this. You'll be able to tap that and it will just take you there. So pro tip, Spotify is awesome for podcast listening, and you can rate the podcast on there. That would be huge. It's a new feature, so there's not as many ratings there as there are in the Apple App Store. So please go rate the podcast 5 stars. We would love that very much. So, okay. Brad says, my goals are to have as much fun as possible while mountain biking. Being more fit makes it more fun. That is the truth right there. Being more fit, because mountain biking is so much fun, but if you're completely boxed the whole time, it sucks the fun right out of it. So he says, I've seen a big increase in FTP since using TrainerRoad. I'm on the cross-country Olympic plan and was thrilled to use FTP estimation instead of taking another FTP test. Way to go. Yes. Amber, new feature just went out with that. Is that correct? Or am I overstepping and saying that now if you use AI FTP detection, when you do that, you used to just get a template, like a basic workout tossed in, hard-coded one. Has that changed for everybody yet?
So now if you use AI FTP, so if you have a ramp test, you can, instead of taking the ramp test, click a button, use FTP detection. And then our AI FTP detection tool will detect your new FTP. If you accept that, you don't have to take the ramp test, and we will actually replace that with a custom workout. So an adapted workout that is individualized according to your plan.
Which is pretty awesome, because now you'll be able to, your same day that you have a test, whereas before you might have had that test, whatever, if you did a ramp test or if you did any other testing format, that might have blown out your day, maybe even the next day. Now you can keep your training on track. And if you add that up, I don't know, let's say that you take somewhere around like 6 or 8 tests per year that you do. If you do that, that's 8 training days that you now get, which by the end of the year, if you add up 8 training days, that's not insignificant. That's something that's valuable. Yeah. So that's a cool thing. I just used it this week, Amber. It said that I was not at 305 anymore. I'm at 313. I accepted.
Nice.
My ego was very happy with that as well. Now we get to see if my legs are happy, but adaptive training will take care of that. I don't have to worry about that. So it's pretty exciting stuff. Okay. So Brad says, my question is, what is the best way to use TrainerRoad 2 days per week? And our low volume plans have 3 workouts per week. Our mid volume have 4 to 5. And then our high volume typically have 5 to 6. So that's the context here. And he says, I like to ride hard on my mountain bike. And I've found that the 3 workouts plus 2 mountain bike rides, read hard mountain bike rides, and a hike every week is too much. Will it mess up adaptive training? Yeah, it is. It sounds fun though. I like that.
Yeah.
It says, will it mess up adaptive training by skipping the 3rd workout? Do I mark it as a completed outdoor ride if my mountain bike ride was similar? Outdoor rides can't really be easy since I live in San Diego and the trails are only in areas where it's too steep to build townhouses. Any advice is appreciated. Thanks to the TrainerRoad team. So Brad, I'm going to go through and Amber and I can kind of go through and alternate through these ones. But the first question that you say is, will it mess up adaptive training by skipping the 3rd workout? So let's say you have 2 out of 3 workouts. Amber, what would you say to that?
It won't mess up the training in that adaptive training will adapt. So regardless of which workout you skip, adaptive training will adapt your plan accordingly. So you can still progress through the plan. If you're missing the same day every week, then probably, then you might not progress through the plan the way the plan intends. But that might not be a terrible thing in your case because you're not necessarily trying to specialize for a specific event. So you will get fitter. You will get faster. It's just not going to progress you the way that the plan intends is the only thing. But no, it's not going to mess up adaptive training for you. Adaptive training adjusts to you and to what you are doing. So you can't really mess it up.
Yeah, exactly. His next question of outdoor rides, or forgive me, do I mark it as a completed outdoor ride if my mountain bike ride was similar? So in this case, he's saying, let's say Brad skips Fridays. And if Brad skips Fridays, and then Brad does his mountain bike ride, has a blast, and then he comes back. And then on TrainerRoad, you can associate, you can say, well, I did that ride, but it was outside, and you can mark it as completed. I wouldn't do that, Brad, unless it really closely matched the profile of the workout, because that's what you're really wanting to get at here is if you're marking it as completed, that's going to tell adaptive training for now. In the future, it's going to analyze your outdoor rides and give you credit for every energy system where you got benefit from that ride. And it's really exciting. But for now, what it will do is it will just trust you. And when you say that you completed that workout, it will say, okay, I'm going to mark that as a completion. So I assume that that athlete did that workout as it was prescribed. So I wouldn't want to do that because then that could get you in a spot. Let's say that that's your threshold day. I'm just throwing this out there. That's your threshold day. And you just keep marking them completed. And as a result, you've moved up around 0.3 to 0.5 per week in your progression levels. And you've just marched along. And at the end of your 8 weeks, then you have like a threshold workout that you actually can do. Well, like come as a shock, no threshold training to suddenly do a threshold workout and have a higher level than you have been doing. So that's why I wouldn't do that. Maxine, actually, I think I'm going to share my screen here so I can show what I think would be a better approach for this. Because I think personally, Train Now would be a fantastic approach for this. So this is my calendar, by the way. Happy threshold workout day for me. But if I click on Train Now, I'm going to try to narrate this for people that are listening on the podcast. But what it does is it gives you 3 different recommendations or 3 different categories of workouts: endurance, climbing, and attacking. And then it allows me to select the duration that I want. So if I only have 30 minutes that day, it's going to give me workouts that are 30 minutes. But if I have 90 minutes, it's going to give me workouts that are 90 minutes. And if I don't like any of those, I can also hit refresh and then it will give me fresh workouts if I don't like the way a certain workout looks. I think this would actually be a great fit for you, Brad, because then you'd be able to just get in 2 quality workouts. They won't drive you toward a specific plan. And Brad, you didn't mention this. I don't know if you have like a specific race you're preparing for, if you're just trying to be more fit. And if you're just trying to be more fit for mountain biking, Train Now is awesome because it's going to give you structured training that will give you aerobic fitness and get you there. And something kind of cool that it does is recommended badge here. The reason it says recommended is because I've been training hard this week and so this is kind of sneaky, but what it does is it actually looks at your outside rides and it does a level of analysis that is nowhere near as in depth as it will do in the future. But it looks at that and says, oh, that was kind of a hard day yesterday. I'm not going to recommend that they do a climbing workout or an attacking workout, which attacking is usually short, higher intensity efforts. Climbing is usually more sustained efforts around threshold. So it knows that. So when you do your outside rides, if you have a power meter on there, it's going to say, oh, Brad did a really hard workout yesterday, so I'm just going to recommend an endurance workout today. So it still wouldn't drive you too deep. All these workouts are productive, as you can see as well, which is really cool. So that way you know that when you drop in, it's never going to give you something too hard. So yeah, I think that would be a great approach. Maxine, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for everybody, but that's in TrainerRoad. It's kind of the two ways that people train with TrainerRoad. It's like you follow a plan or you can do train now. And I think a lot of athletes would actually really benefit from following the train now side of things, unless you have a very specific goal you're going for, like a race or an event, or, you know, you're doing something like you want the constant, I guess, what would it be? The constant fact of having a training plan where you have to knock out those workouts. If you feel like that's beneficial to keeping you going, then a training plan would be great too. But otherwise, train now is pretty good.
And one thing to note about train now, in case people aren't aware of it, I just want to make sure that we say this explicitly. It is adaptive to you. So it's going to be the workouts that you see on train now are based on the same model that makes adaptations on a custom training plan. So if you're on a custom training plan, it's going to adapt you, but train now does the same thing, only it's just not on a plan. It's just when you go in and you see these workout options and you can, like Jonathan said, adjust duration, it is the same model that is making those recommendations for you. So it will progress you. And so the workouts that you see will continually match your increase in fitness and be appropriate for you. So you'll still be eating all the right workouts. It just won't be part of a plan. It's just a different approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points, Amber. I want to spend some time talking about this from a larger concept perspective of fitting training into riding versus fitting riding into training, because there's you can almost like divide or identify a person and put them into a group based off of this. A person either trains and they fit in riding when they can, or they ride and they fit in training where they can. And they're two kind of very different approaches. I feel like there's no right or wrong way, and it's very personal to what you want to do. And I have had to bounce back and forth from this, where I'm like, I am training all the time. And I get to a point where I'm like, I have not actually just ridden my bike in months because I'm just training. And I can fall out of love with the bike a little bit and lose some intrinsic motivation when I do that. If I'm just training all the time and I'm not just getting out and enjoying the bike. For some people, that is totally, that's fine with them. And I can probably go years, honestly, like that and still go. But I do find that everything is a bit better when I really enjoy riding the bike. And I get that from training, but I really get it from riding, when I can just have a day where I'm riding fun trails with friends or doing a nice group ride or a beautiful road ride or something. So there's no right or wrong way. And you might go back and forth throughout it. Hannah, at least for me personally, Hannah, how do you feel about that as a pro athlete? Because it's your job to train. Do you find yourself getting in the spots where you never ride and you just train?
I think riding is also my job. I think that riding and training should go together. Especially when we're talking about skill work, the best skill work I can do is when I'm playing on my bike. And I think that's something that a lot of kids are really excellent at, is they go out and they're willing to just play on a jump for hours and hours and hours. And that's what makes little kids such good bike handlers, is they play. And so I think that's something that I actually sometimes need to force myself to do more, is to just ride. And so being a very type A person, I still have to schedule this time because it doesn't necessarily come naturally, but I like to put it all together so that I still have that feeling of accomplishment. And then I don't feel any stress when I, turn off my bike computer, put it in the back pocket, or not turn it off. Let's be honest. I still record it, but I put it in the back pocket so I'm not looking at it, and just go ride. And so usually how I do that is I'll have my workout and I'll do my intervals and I'll, focus and make sure I hit everything the way I need to. And then I'll have a planned amount of time after that where I'm just riding. It could be, and then I jump on the trails for 30 minutes or 45 or 60. Sometimes it's hours. Sometimes I'll have a 1 hour, quote unquote, training ride. but I'm going to ride for 4 hours that day. So then I have 3 hours unstructured where I'm just on the trails, having fun, doing what I need to do. And if that's a possibility for this individual, that is what I would recommend, because it sounds like what you're really trying to fulfill is a love for your bike alongside being fit. And so it seems to me that if you're doing 3 workouts plus 2 mountain bike rides, why not do 2 workouts and then whatever the math is on that,
Mm-hmm.
basically just do your workouts and then have some of them also be mountain bike rides, do the ride. And then after the workout, keep riding. And maybe one of you can explain how that would work on the TrainerRoad platform. Would that be extended cool down, or how would they do that?
With outside workouts, it's pretty darn easy. So any workout you have on your calendar, you can just make it an outside workout, and then it automatically pushes to your Garmin or Wahoo.
Perfect.
One of the ways that I do this locally is trails usually have some vertical element to them, right? So I go up the road part, and I'll either, if I have time in between intervals, I'll go up a road, then down a trail in between, or I'll just do my repeats on the road, get my intervals done. And then after that, I'm at the trailhead, and then I can just ride down. I can add on, just like you said, because once you accomplish the workout on your Garmin or Wahoo, it even, like on Garmin, it even plays like a cute little tone when you finish. You're done, it celebrates. And then at that point, you can just ride. Like, so that's the best way to do it. And outside workouts, you can do these workouts outside, and it's just a great way to do it, Brad, in this case. More athletes should... I was going to say more athletes should be using the outside workouts year round in this capacity. Like, let's say you're racing and you have a race season going through, drop down on your volume and use TrainerRoad to get workouts that are qualified use. Then you aren't trying to do workouts midweek that are blowing you up and doing too much. Then you end up not fresh at your workout or at your races. Or if you go to a point where you train a lot, then after that, you just want to ride all summer. You just want to do amazing rides. You should absolutely use TrainerRoad for that purpose too, just to top off your fitness. 1 to 2 interval workouts a week, and you'll be fine. And it's a great way to do it. So yeah, I think it's underutilized, and it makes, like Brad said, riding way more enjoyable when you're fit. And we hear so many times when athletes are like, yeah, I'm super fit in the spring. And then in the summer, they're like, oh, I'm not fit. Riding is really hard. And it's because you don't have to do a lot, just 1 to 2 workouts a week, and you can maintain a whole lot with it. So it's a good approach. And sorry, Amber.
A workout is really just like a set of intervals within a ride, along the lines of what Hannah was describing. And one of the really nice features of exporting your workouts to a head unit is, and I'm not sure if you haven't used it before, you might not realize this, but you don't have to start the interval until you decide to. So you start the interval when you're at the hill where you want to do your repeats, or at the road where you want to do your repeats, or when it's safe. And so you hit that lap button, and then that's when you start. So it's not like you roll out of your driveway and you better start your interval
Gotta go.
in exactly 10 minutes. No, it doesn't work that way. So you can ride out to where you're comfortable doing your interval set, and you start it when you're ready, when you feel safe, when you're in the right place. It's a really, really cool feature. And you can, like Jonathan said, you can keep your fitness on track. And like Hannah said, you can do both at the same time. You keep your fitness on track with a little bit of structure, but you throw that into a bigger loop or trail or route that is really appealing and fun and allows you to do some playing.
Yeah. Great advice, Hannah, on doing both instead of just putting yourself into one of the buckets, right? I think it's a great way to do it. Okay, Paul says, hi there, huge fan of TrainerRoad as well as the podcast. Thank you so much. Y'all are awesome. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Paul.
He says, question for you about the proper approach to steep climbs. I heard a question asked previously on the podcast about steep climbs at the end of the race, and y'all focused rightly on nutrition strategies to remain strong at the end. My challenge is more about steepness. I'm an 80 kilogram rider with an FTP of 288, so about 3.5 watts per kilogram. What I am seeing is that, especially on short and steep climbs, I have no choice but to be putting out VO2 level watts in order to take on the climb. I ride mostly road and gravel and have a SRAM 2x setup with a 46-33 in the front and a 10-36 in the rear. So I have even lower than a 1-to-1 ratio, which is awesome to have. Good on you for having that. It says, while I can put out these efforts, my goal is to be training for long 100-mile events. And I'm also trying to heed your advice of keeping my efforts controlled at an IF of somewhere around 0.7. So when I get to steep sections, I feel like I'm either going to put out too many watts that put me in a hole later, or I'm just doing something wrong. So what advice would you give for how to think about controlling your efforts on long rides and races when climbing gets steep? Clearly, I can and should lose weight. He says that. Paul, we're not even going to focus on that part. That's a product of your training, and everything else, you just let that be what it is. Okay. Paul says, but wondering what other tips and suggestions you have. So Maxine, I'm going to kind of like spring this on you. I apologize, but I have a blog post that's fantastic on this, and I'd like to share it. So I'm going to open this one up. We have a blog post called How to Build a Pacing Plan for Long Events. And I think that it could be fantastic for helping you out and giving you kind of some base guidelines for everybody listening to this that wants to figure out about pacing. So this is written by Jesse, who's in our live chat right now. He's amazing. Thank you, Jesse.
He's amazing. Hi, Jesse.
And there's some basics that I want to run through, because you mentioned that 0.7 thing. So if your event is somewhere around 20 minutes, you can probably safely do somewhere between 1 to 1.05 intensity factor. Amber, can you describe what intensity factor is really quick, actually, before I go any further?
Well, it's what it sounds like. It is a measure of intensity. And so we kind of look at a 1 hour effort of 1.0 IF as being a max all out effort. And that's kind of the benchmark of what we look at for intensity. And then you can imagine that higher intensity, you would need to shorten the duration, and lower intensity, you could increase the duration. And that's what I think you're going to get into here in terms of pacing recommendations.
Exactly. And just now you saw a pop up to subscribe to the blog. I recommend you do. It will make you faster. So, and so when we're talking about 20 minutes at 1.05, that's going to see you just over threshold, because you can probably do that for 20 minutes. 1 hour, that would be like an hour record. If you were able to hold 1 IF for the whole time, that would be amazing. When the events get to 1.5 to 2.5 hours, you're probably looking at being able to sustain somewhere around 0.9, 2.5 to 4.5 hours, somewhere around 0.8. And then 4.5, even all the way up to like 16 hours, at least the data shows that you can probably maintain 0.7. So it's kind of funny to see how the windows get larger and larger as the IF gets lower. So it isn't a linear relationship with this. But if your event, and we were talking about pacing your event and trying to find even pacing for it, that's what you'd be looking at in terms of ballparks on where to go. So Maxine, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but everybody should check out that article. It's called How to Build a Pacing Plan for Long Events. Has fantastic insight in there. But within this, it's really important that we don't think that just because you need to average somewhere around 0.7, that you can't break 0.7, because that's like, it's impossible. I mean, like, it's possible, but you're probably going to go real slow, and you might even have to get off and walk going up some of these hills like you're talking about in this case, Paul. So I wouldn't blame you on that one. What happens, I guess, so let's just say you can't strictly adhere to that tight 0.7. I guess what happens then? Amber, what advice would you have in this case for pacing your effort over these longer events with these short, steep climbs?
Well, first things first, achieving a particular intensity factor isn't necessarily going to be a product of a perfectly even pace, right? So you're going to have increases and decreases in pace, and the intensity factor will take all of those into account toward the end. So there is a lot of wiggle room here. If you have to go much higher over FTP, that's not necessarily going to ruin your pace as long as you drop back down below FTP low enough and long enough to recover from that effort. So it's not going to blow you up. It's not going to ruin your race. It's not going to ruin your pacing strategy, even especially if it's a short, punchy climb. It's a shorter amount of time where you're over FTP. So I wouldn't stress too much about that.
Yeah, Amber,
go ahead,
one
Jonathan.
quick thing on it. Jesse just jumped in. We probably should have explained the formula with this too, but the formula for intensity factor is normalized power divided by FTP. So that's like a really, like Amber said, that's why this is going to be a representative average of the ride rather than something that like you have to perfectly hold this thing and then it adjusts.
Right, exactly. The other thing about this is bigger riders can generally hold higher absolute power. Now, this is a generalization. It's not going to be true in every individual case, but in general, this is true. So I think a lot of us, I'll count myself among the bigger riders, worry about climbs. But if you're talking about short, punchy climbs, even if they're steep, if it's a short climb, absolute power is still your friend. And so, and a good example of this is in the spring classics, right? Those are steep, hard climbs, but they're short. So the riders that you see having a lot of success there are riders who have very, very high absolute power. So I say this because I don't want you to count yourself out, but telling yourself some story in your head about how you're a bigger rider and it's too steep. No. This could actually be to your benefit. So get, self-doubt out the window. Don't count yourself out. This might actually be to your advantage in some cases. And then in terms of pacing, if you're talking about like a really long event, like a gravel event, and I think Hannah can probably speak to this even better than I can. If you're by yourself in the race and you're going to be by yourself a lot in the race, then you get to decide how fast you go up this hill. The only time that you're really going to be forced into a particular power output would be in some cases, like you said, if you try to, you might have to put out a certain amount of power just to not fall over. That can happen.
Yep.
In which case, don't stress about it. Just put that power out and then recover. And then the other time that you might be forced out of a pace that you want to do is where you're in an actual race selection scenario. So if you're still with a group and your goal is to stay with that group and that group is going really hard up this climb, you might have to go a little harder than you wanted to in order to stay with that group. In these big, longer events, it is always worth it to try to stay with the group. Because even if you have to go harder to stay with that group, chances are you're going to have the benefit of a draft afterwards to get the recovery you need to bring that average back down so that you're still within that pacing strategy. So I would just, with those exceptions in mind, I think that you can definitely still execute your pacing strategy even with steep climbs in the mix. And I want to turn it over to Hannah because I think she has a lot more experience with stuff like this.
So I'm curious what you would think of this, because I think that people ask this question all the time. And it's interesting to think, so if you're on a really steep climb and you're in a group and you need to stay with this group, how long is too long to be above your pacing strategy? Because at some point it might be that you're with the wrong group and you should be in a slower group. What do you think is that time limit?
Yeah, I actually so on long events, if it's a short event, I do not cap myself. Like it's just like I'm thinking about your short track and XCO.
Yeah.
My body wants to cap it, but I can't let that happen because you can't do it. But for long events, I actually put a ceiling on things. So, and that's like a percentage of FTP ceiling. So I'll say that like, okay, Leadville is a good example, actually. I knew that at Leadville, after adjusting my FTP for altitude, which always just blows your mind to realize how much lower your FTP is when you're up at 9,000, 10,000 feet. But after adjusting for everything like that, I think that I figured that I would have a fantastic day at Leadville if I could do 0.82 or something like that, like just above 0.8. So my goal was to average somewhere around there. But my other goal was, when I was going up climbs, was to do everything I possibly could to ride at somewhere below 0.95, to not let myself go over it. And that was my personal ceiling. That could change for everybody. But as a result, what usually happened is that people blew by me in the beginning of the race on the climbs, and then I would see them later and they would look very sad. So as I just was able to then hold 0.8 just fine on the flat sections of road, and I would reel them in. So the capping thing can be really helpful in this situation, particularly if it's not a scenario where it's like you're racing for the front of the field, because in those cases, you don't really get much of a choice. If your main goal is to win, you have to do what's necessary to win. But otherwise, yeah, capping is a great way to do it. Hannah, I don't know if you have any experience with that as well, but that's what I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think capping it for power and for time. Because, using your example, if you hold 0.95 up a climb for 5 minutes, no problem. If you hold 0.95 all the way up Columbine for whatever that is, an hour, probably a problem.
You're not going to come down, at least not on your bike. Yeah.
So it's a delicate situation. And I think you can create loose boundaries, and those boundaries are going to be different for everyone. It's going to depend if you're in really deep and you're in this group and the next group is out of sight and it is what it is, it's going to depend if you're racing for the win or if you're racing to finish. There's so many contingencies in this question. And so my advice would be to create those barriers for yourself before you get into the race. And there's really no right or wrong answer as to what those, well, I guess there is a wrong, but there's a really big, like you have a lot of room to play. You know, you'd have to be so far out in left field for it to be wrong. That I would just create that before the race. In the race, it's too emotional. Don't create the boundaries in the race. Create them before. You know, it could be, okay, I'm going to hold, this is my cap power. And if I have to hold it for more than 20 minutes, I'm going to back off because that's too much for me. Perfect. That is a great scenario. Dial it in. After that, don't think about it. Don't worry about it because that is too much stress. You're just putting stress on top of stress. If you're not holding your pacing strategy and you're stressing about not holding your pacing strategy, this is worst case scenario. It's just too much to put on yourself. So, you know, in this question, if you're talking about a shorter climb that you literally cannot go easier on, because there are climbs like that, especially on the mountain bike and gravel bike, you know, your option is to put out the power or to walk. Just put out the power. It's okay. Don't worry about it. You know, you don't want to walk up the climb, just put out the power, acknowledge that you just put out the power, and then handle it after. When you get to the top of the climb, you might think, oh, I just spent 5 minutes above threshold. I used more energy and more calories. I'm going to take a minute to recover and fuel. I'm going to take an extra gel now because I just put out a little more energy than I planned on it. So I'm going to reward my body with the fuel it needs to continue. The other things are, if you're in a group and it's hurting and it's struggling, and you know for a fact that this group is a group you should be in, know that everybody's working above their FTP. Know that it hurts for everybody. Know that everybody's going to struggle after, and the pace will probably decline. And all of you will have a declining power profile for that race. And if you're in it to win it or in it to win that group, that's fine. There's no prize at that point for, you know, who had the most steady power output. Then it's just a matter of being willing to stay in it and to suffer and to know that everybody else is suffering. If you're the loner and everyone else seems to be okay, and you don't know anyone in the group and you don't know if it's the right group, and you learn that maybe you are above your caliber in that group, the answer is to keep working, to keep training, and to raise your FTP so that next time going up that climb, you are at your FTP in order to summit it instead of vastly over. So there's a lot of answers to this question. And I think that's a good thing because there's just so many different ways you can approach it. And it's not, pacing shouldn't be a stressful, scary thing. It should be something to help you execute the race better. And I see so many athletes stress so hard over the pacing. And it bums me out a little bit because I want people to just experience the race for what it is. So set those boundaries and then just be confident and enjoy whatever happens, because that's part of racing, is being able to adapt and enjoy the experience.
I have 3 other points on this one. Paul's doing great on gearing. Good job. That's one of the biggest, like easiest, relatively easiest gets. Sometimes it's easier to buy things than it is. You can't buy fitness. So like that part can be tough, but the gearing can really help you. The raising your FTP thing is so good. Like Hannah said, there are very few problems on the bike that a higher FTP doesn't solve. Like that's just the way it works. Higher FTP means you can take a whole lot more blows. It's just, everything's better. But the last point that I wanted to reinforce, because we've already talked about it here, but the shorter the event, the less capping you should do of your pacing. The longer the event, especially if it's one where you know that you're going to be pushed toward your limits, that's when that starts to become more important. So really keep that in mind when you're weighing how to build out a pacing strategy. You have your average that you'll probably end up somewhere around, and let yourself be okay with going above and below that. as the race demands it. But then, yeah, if it's longer, introduce the capping. If it's a cross country race, like a cross country Olympic race, man, sometimes it can work out because, especially in amateur fields, because amateurs might just go so hard from the gun, way over their limits and blow themselves up, whereas a pro can just keep going hard. But for us amateurs, that might happen. So you might be in a good spot of kind of not capping, but just focusing on your average. But really, short races, go with the moves, engage in the race, focus on that. Longer races, that's when it can be such a help to have this sort of stuff in place. So let's go into Oscar's question. It says, first of all, I want to thank the whole TR team. You all are amazing, and I wish you the best. My question is, thanks, Oscar. Appreciate that. My question is related to the recovery week. I've been doing structured training for 2 years, and the recovery weeks are quite difficult. My mood changes. I eat less. I get upset more easily, and I feel more stressed. But that never happens when I'm on a training block, meaning that he's in the loading weeks, I assume. It's like training hard just balances things on my mood and mental health. Do you have any tips or something that you can recommend to avoid feeling like that during the week? I guess let's go to Hannah first on this one. And then Amber, I'm sure that you have some thoughts on this too. But what are your thoughts when you look at Oscar's question, not experiencing this during the loading weeks, but then during the recovery week where it's a deload week where you're doing less? He mentions that he eats less, his mood changes, gets more upset more easily, feels more stressed during those weeks. What are your thoughts?
I think this is really common. I think a lot of people feel kind of poopy during a recovery week and it's normal. But it still doesn't mean we should just, just because something's common doesn't mean it's good. So, the first thing I think of is nutrition. A lot of people eat less on a recovery week, and that, being hangry is a bad time. So it could be something as simple as that your mood is poor because you're hungry. So that's a simple thing seemingly to change. Just make sure that you're getting enough fuel for your body. It could be something like the training load is too high, even though you're not feeling it in that week. It could be rolling over into the recovery. But the other thing I would just think it's important to mention is to ask yourself what role the bike is playing in your life. If you analyze these other outside factors and you're not seeing, I'm eating enough, I'm sleeping enough, I know I'm not training too much, but I'm still grumpy when I'm not riding. I think a lot of people use the bike as an outlet that can help bring us joy or help us modulate stress or anxiety or other mental health situations. And that's great. It's an amazing tool, but it's also important that we don't give it too much power. We have to be full humans without the bike as well. So if exercise is something that you've been prescribed for a mental health routine, that's great. I'm glad that your doctor is prescribing something like that, but find something that you enjoy outside of the bike as well, so that you're loving yourself as a person and not connecting your identity to the bicycle in particular. Get out for a walk, spend time with friends or family, other things that can help you feel that fullness and not just feeling the success or, whatever that rush is that you might get from the bike. You really want to step back and analyze and make sure that you should never feel less than. You should never feel not accomplished because you're not riding. You training and racing and pushing your body doesn't make you a better person. It might make you feel better, but it doesn't make you better. We're all equal. We're all wonderful people. And so just make sure that even when you're not training, you don't let those thoughts creep into your head because they're not true. You're still excellent.
Mm-hmm. That's it's really easy to talk. Well, especially for you two, having professions within this, like careers as cyclists, but it's really easy for amateurs even to purely identify with the bike. Right. And if you're not riding the bike, it's like, I haven't ridden in 3 days. I don't even think I'm a cyclist anymore. We've all felt that.
And it's too easy to attach your self-worth to it. It really is. And it's not something, if you're experiencing this, it's not something to be ashamed of. so many of us have felt this attachment of self-worth. It's just important to acknowledge those thoughts. Oh, wow, I'm feeling this way and it's not right. And then you get to push that thought out and remind yourself of something else that makes you a full and important person.
Yeah. Amber, what are your thoughts on this?
I echo everything that Hannah said. I think that's really well said. And I think a lot of people do, we try our best not to, but it's hard not to attach a sense of identity and self-worth to our training. Setting that aside for a second, training, like if that might not be the problem for everybody, right? And you may still feel this way in a rest week. And I think for a lot of us, training is a clear justification to take time for yourself, right? Like the time on the bike is the time that I get to take for myself. I'm a parent, I work full time, and this is the time that I get to take for me. And it feels justified because it's my training. But if you're not training, maybe 2 hours a day, like you normally would, as an example, and now you're down to 30 minutes or an hour of recovery or even a rest day, most of us are going to tend to fill that time with other things being chores or tasks or things that are not time for ourselves. And it's still okay on a rest week to carve out that time and take that time for yourself. And maybe part of what helps you feel balanced when you're in a train block is the fact that you get outside and you get some sunshine. Maybe it's just the fact that you get some solitude and you get a little break for your brain. Maybe some breath work would be really helpful, and taking some me time to step outside, do some breathing work, take an easy walk, maybe just sitting outside on your lunch break. So trying to identify what are some of the key elements in the training that help you feel balanced aside from the efforts, right? Like the actual magnitude of the efforts. And you might be able to weave some of those things back into a recovery week so that you're still taking time for yourself, so that you're still giving your brain a break. So you're still having some, really connected breath work or getting outside in nature, whatever that might be for you. And it's going to be different for everybody, but you can still incorporate some of those elements in a rest week while you're giving your body the break that it needs from the training intensity.
Yeah. Rest weeks, it's so easy to undereat because you assume, okay, and I really love this idea that Pete had at one point on the podcast where he said, and I'm sure that this is not just beholden to Pete, but it impacted me when Pete said it, of not measuring your weight every day and instead just looking at it like an average that's like balanced out over time. And the same thing I feel like applies to nutrition, at least for me. If I measure my calories every day and I'm trying to balance every single day, number one, that's a whole lot of stress for me. I do like to check in on that. So not frequently, but like once a month for a week, I'll measure and I'll look at things. And that way it keeps me on track. But it would be more beneficial to look at this at over a longer time period, because if you look at your workouts and you think I need to eat enough so that I zero out every day or whatever balance you're trying to maintain, if you're doing that, you'll get into those recovery weeks and you will not eat as much. But it's arguable that your body does not get faster by dosing it with more training. It gets faster as it responds to that training and as it adapts to that training. That happens during recovery. That happens every night, every day when you're not training. And it also happens in a much more concentrated dose during those deload weeks, because your body has less stress coming in. It has more time to be, in a parasympathetic state. So then that way your body can always be recovering during that week. That's the intent of it. So if you're not eating as much, recovery, adaptation, building muscle, building connections, doing all this stuff, all of that takes resources. And if you're starving yourself during the recovery week, that's not a good way to make it so that the next block of loading is going to be sustainable. It's likely going to go against you and make you hangry. So I would recommend that people don't look at trying to finish at zeros on their balance with their calories or something else during those weeks. Instead, eat as you feel. And what's interesting is we hear from a lot of athletes that they are so hungry during their recovery week. And they're like, I wonder why, because I'm not doing as much work. Well, it's because your body's still doing a ton of work behind the scenes that you don't realize. So give yourself the body or the food that your body needs. And then as a result, you'll be able to fuel well. And if anything, maybe use that recovery week that you have. If you're, once again, you're still training probably, but just not doing quite as much. maybe fill the extra time that you have with cooking and preparing like really high quality things that really interest you, like new foods, different things like that. Just like giving yourself high quality nutrition in that week, I think is a really important thing to focus on.
And I think just in general,
sorry,
remembering that the reason you have a recovery week is because you are tired. I think a lot of people go into recovery weeks and think it's a recovery week. Why do I feel tired? That's why. Because if we anticipated that you felt good, we would prescribe you more hard workout. Yes. So take that as a big pat on the back that not only have you put in the hard work, but you've timed your training really well and you're giving your body exactly what it needs to be the best that it can be.
So true.
Yeah. The other thing that I would say too is this is personal and maybe it's relatable for other people. When I go and I have a lot of training and I've been building up and putting a lot of time in it, I tend to sacrifice getting other things done for training. So I'll have a lot of unclosed loops up in my brain, right? Where like, I need to do this and that loop is not closed yet. And I'll have a bunch of them. And then if I'm in the rest week and I'm super tired and I haven't been able to accomplish those things, man, they weigh really heavily because I'm like, well, now you have more time. So why haven't you closed the loops? That's the internal dialogue that goes on. And it just adds a ton of stress and it can be really frustrating. So I would encourage you to examine your loading weeks. Maybe you have too much training volume, not for what your body can sustain, but for what your life can sustain. Maybe you need to drop down the training volume a touch. You'll get more out of it. You'll be able to have a more sustainable trajectory over a longer period of time, and your life will be better in balance. I'm not saying that's the case, Oscar. I'm just speaking to myself, and hopefully it helps other people too. But I've found that when I train too much, everything else tends to suffer. If it was my job and everything else, then I would focus my life around that, but it's not my job. So I have to change that around. So yeah, those are the tips. It's normal to feel kind of like Hannah said, it's normal to feel poopy during your recovery week. That's okay. Make sure you're eating enough. Make sure that you're not associating your identity to time spent on the bike and TSS accumulated. Instead, you are your own person, and the bike is just a fun thing that you can use to be able to achieve balance. Great chat in the live chat right now going on too. Once again, join us on YouTube. It's a good thing to do. Frederick, his question, how do you select the right mountain bike tires to use? For example, how do you weigh traction versus rolling resistance? On the podcast, Jonathan mentions his tire choices from time to time, but I haven't heard a deep dive on that. I'll be doing the High Cascades 100 in July. It's the only race I've ever DNF'd, and he mentions that this happened in 2020, and I've competed 10 long distance triathlons. It's on a mix of forest roads and single tracks in Central Oregon, is dry and dusty at that time. I've seen people that finish High Cascades 100 and usually it's just like two white eyes and the rest is just like brown Oregon dust. They're like one single color. So yes. And I've heard it's really hard. So Hannah, I'd like to ask you first, are you a picky tire person, and how do you go about deciding what tires you use?
I've definitely gotten pickier over the years. I think that tires are something that there's a lot of really great options out there, and, stressing over it is not the way to go. But the more aware you become, the more you can benefit from the nuances. So if you're really someone who's super aware about how they feel on the trail, tires are a great thing to experiment with and to play with because they can make a huge difference, especially on really unique terrain. So, one of the first things I look at is going to be the amount of traction that I need. And the first place that I usually gain that is actually with tire width and with tire pressure. So the wider the tire, the more surface area I can cover on the trail and the lower pressure that I can run. So that's the first place that I try and gain traction is with a wider tire. So in most races nowadays, in most XCO races nowadays, I'm running a 2.4 because I can run quite a bit lower pressure and really feel like I'm getting really good traction through that.
It's amazing.
Yeah. The next thing after that is I'm going to look at the lugs and the knobs. And a lot of that is going to correspond with what the course is running like and what the dirt texture is like. If there's a lot of really intense coursing, I'm going to look for something with a larger side lug and really good knobs to be able to dig into the corners. If it's a pretty fast rolling course, then I'm going to look for that lower profile lug. And then I am going to focus more on that rolling resistance, which usually I would take the rolling resistance from having lighter lugs or shorter lugs than from having less traction, aka a skinnier tire or higher pressure. So that's kind of the second thing I look at. And then the third thing is going to be the casing, which is going to probably be the weight of the tire. And almost always I'm going to go for something with a stronger casing. So I just think that the slowest thing you can do is get a sidewall slash. And so I'd rather carry around, it's such a small amount of weight nowadays because tires are really exceptional. And so I almost always go for something with slightly heavier with more sidewall protection. And then I use all of these things together to determine what tire pressure I'm going to run in that tire. Like I said, if it's a fast rolling course and I'm on a 2.2, then it has to be a higher pressure innately. If I'm on a 2.4, then I get to start to play with a little bit lower pressures. And then the conditions, the type of hits, the type of terrain, all of those things will play into just how low I can get away with.
Oh, they're great tips. And that's basically exactly what I do when I pick out tires too. What are your specific picks that you run? I'm sure you're sponsored by a company as well.
Yeah, I get to run Kenda tires. So Kenda is one of my partners this year. So my go-to tire with them is typically the Rush because it's really light and fast and it's fast rolling. And then if I feel like I just need just a little bit more than that, just a little bit, just slightly burlier, where I feel like I'm still not really sacrificing any rolling resistance, I'll go for the Booster. And those come in both 2.2 and 2.4. So I get to play with that as well, nice, along with those types. And then for mud, which inevitably almost always comes into play in Europe, I'll do the Karma. And then for gravel, I would do either the Flint Ridge Pro, which is going to be a gravel tire that does have some knobs and traction, or I'd do the Fortitude Pro, which is pretty much just a really wide slick, just with maybe ever so slight traction, but that's a fast tire.
That's like a Belgian waffle ride tire that you would use.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So then where you're on the road and that. This is for your situation, Frederick, having a lot of dusty conditions. I think that this is where insurance comes into play for two reasons. Dusty conditions typically mean there will be things hidden underneath the surface that you won't find until your tires find them, which is not ideal. So that means that I would run, and you've DNF'd it before, so you probably know, but I don't know if you DNF'd because of a flat or what the reason was, but I would err on a longer course with dusty conditions. I would err with a tire that's going to have a thicker casing. So typically most companies are going to have a light casing and then a reinforced casing. And they may even have higher reinforcements than that, but go with some sort of reinforcement. And then also, like Hannah said, having shoulder knobs or the side knobs that protrude a bit more are the sort of things that give you insurance when traction gets real Western on you and it gets wild. In those moments, that's when you're really grateful that you have them. There's one other cool thing that you can look for. If the knobs on the top of your tire, the center knobs, as we call them, and then your shoulder knobs, the side knobs, if there's a gap in between those center knobs and the shoulder knobs, that's going to feel like you are locked in when you're on that. If the gap is filled in with other intermediate knobs that alternate or switch around, it's going to make it feel less like you have center and then locking in on the sides, and more of a smooth transition without as much real confidence locking in on the sides. So those side knobs do make you slower. So that's why Hannah's talking about on those fast, smooth rolling courses, you might not want something with really big side knobs. But in a situation like this, Frederick, I would recommend getting something that has a little bit of a gap in between those center knobs and shoulder knobs, and those shoulder knobs are prominent enough to be able to dig in. So Hannah just shared some great options on Kenda. I typically tend to run Maxxis tires, and the Recon Race is one that I would use if it's loose and dusty, because it gives me a little bit more confidence when it's locked in on the edge than the Aspen, but I typically run the Aspen in other conditions. And make sure you're carrying tire plugs. Like Dyna plugs, I find are like the best ones. Stan's Dart works really well too. But make sure you're carrying a few plugs to be able to do that. Amber, for a lot of us that don't ride mountain bikes as often, you rode on the roadside. Were you ever picky with your road tires? Because road is tricky where there's a lot more like you really have to be detail oriented, or you have to convince yourself you're noticing things that don't actually exist. One of the two on the road, because it's a lot tougher to tell, right?
I do think that it is. But I would say the tire size and pressure is huge. And that was something that could make a huge difference. I didn't get to do a lot of tire testing because basically from day one of my career, there was a sponsored equipment provider and that was that. So what we had to choose from was really whatever line was available from the particular brand that we were sponsored by that year. And my approach was really basic, which was I would take the most bulletproof, reliable tires for my training bike and train on those because I didn't care how heavy they felt. I just didn't want to deal with flats in training. And it was almost better when they felt heavier because then when I would be with the team and we would be at a race, I would get to run, whatever race version of those tires we had. And then it would feel really light and snappy and good compared to the heavier training tires. So I had a really, really basic approach, but it's a very different ballgame, right? Between road and mountain biking. So yeah.
Makes the race bike feel like a rocket ship when you put them on
exactly.
the fast ones. I might be totally just like convincing myself of things. So big grain of salt here. I do think I'm pretty good at picking up on differences in equipment, and on the road side of things, I notice a big difference a difference in tires. The S-Works turbos are my favorite tires for the feel. They're not my favorite tires for durability. Those things, you run through them so fast. I went through, it's rough. So you go through them quick, but the cornering, like, when you're cornering on a road bike, you're always wondering where the line is. And it's really like just a razor's edge to where that line is. And then when it's too much, you're on the ground already. And the one thing these tires have really helped with is I feel like I get a much more it broadens out that knife's edge. So I get a better indication of traction, like a really good feel. That could be totally me making it up. I don't know. But that compared to like a Continental tire, Continentals just feel like dry and like they aren't actually gripping and providing traction. Instead, they're just rolling. And as a result, I feel like that margin of error, that window before when you are upright and then go down, right back to a razor's edge again when I use something like that. So your mileage may vary and placebo may play a role in this. And if it does, hey, that's a good thing. So not a bad thing.
Like chicken strips and motorcycles.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. No chicken strips. Get rid of those things.
Right.
Burn them off. Okay. So Hannah, I want to ask you specifically for Lifetime Grand Prix races that you're doing. What tires will you be running for the different events there?
Yeah. I think, so I don't know for sure what the course will be like at Seattle, but if it's similar to what it's been in the past, I think it's fairly mellow.
I think it's going to be 2 laps of like that course that you've done before.
Yeah. That's what I thought. Yeah. So fairly mellow. And then Leadville, similar thing, fairly mellow in terms of technical. So for me, a fast rolling tire is going to be my go-to for both of those. So I'll probably do a 2.2 rush. The only thing that I'll do is I'll make sure that it's the strong sidewall casing. So an SCT, because they're such long races, it's insurance.
A lot can happen.
You need it. It's just, it's worth it. So 2.2 rush SCT. And then for Crusher and Big Sugar, I've never done those races, but I get the impression that they're fairly burly. It's almost the opposites. Mellow mountain bike races, really burly gravel races. So I'm guessing it'll be a burlier tire, which would be a burlier gravel tire, which would be the Flint Ridge Pro, and definitely using the extra sidewall protection on those. Big Sugar just seems to be like a giant flat party. So if I can stay out of that, I think I will be golden. So and then I have absolutely no idea what Schwann again is like. So that's a big question mark.
I don't even know how to pronounce that race. And yeah, I don't know. So yeah, I have no
Probably
clue.
just pack a lot of tires and bring them to that one.
Friend of the
There you go.
podcast, Payson, would know.
Yeah.
Because he's done that one. I think he's won that race and he's done it a few times. So yeah. Okay, let's go into James' question. He says, says, hi, TrainerRoad crew. I love TrainerRoad and seeing the progression every year from using your training plans, even though I'm a dad to a couple young kids, all because TrainerRoad makes my training so efficient. Good to hear, James. Love that. Listen to the podcast every week and 5 stars. James says, my question is that I've noticed that progression levels seem to be tethered together. For instance, when you do a threshold workout, sometimes your sweet spot, tempo, or endurance levels also improve. Is this the case? And if so, what is the thinking behind this? So maybe we should explain progression levels first. And actually, producer Maxine, I think I'll share my screen again so you can see my current progression levels in TrainerRoad. So I'll get ready to do that now. And I'll explain this to everybody listening on the podcast. So then it's, you're not just, we're looking at it and oohing and awing and you don't know what you're looking at, or just laughing at my levels. So progression levels, well, those are representations of your abilities in different power zones effectively. So we have endurance, tempo, sweet spot, threshold, VO2 max, anaerobic, and sprint. Those are the different zones. And then what we do based on the workouts you're completing and based on the analysis of adaptive training, it will increase your levels or decrease your levels if you haven't done workouts in those areas appropriately. So imagine yourself like a video game character and you have or maybe you're a car, you have great acceleration, low top speed, but good handling, and then decent braking, something like that. Think of yourself like that. And that's what the progression levels give you. But it's all tied into what you're actually doing, which is really cool. So you can see here that I'm an endurance level 5.4 right now, tempo 2.2, because I haven't been doing a lot of tempo work. And I haven't been doing a lot of anaerobic and sprint. Those are down at 1. I've been doing more sweet spot stuff, but a lot of more endurance stuff lately. And since I just raised my FTP, thanks to AI FTP detection, it's that my numbers dropped back, or my levels drop back down a bit. So then I get more appropriate workouts. But the cool part about this is that as you do more workouts in a zone and as you accomplish more, your levels go up. If you don't do workouts in a specific zone, your levels will go down because of what we call energy system decay. Don't top it off and don't touch it up, then it starts to fall apart. So Maxine, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. But those are the progression levels for context on what we're talking about. Now, with this in mind, James' question is that he has noticed that some of them, and I'm going to read this one more time, I've noticed that progression levels seem to be tethered together. For instance, when you do a threshold workout, sometimes your sweet spot tempo or endurance levels also improve. And so he's asking, what's the logic behind this? And I went straight to one of the sources here. We have amazing employees here at TrainerRoad. Talked to Alhan, one of the main, I guess he's a product manager, but also he's darn near an engineer too. Does a lot of work. He's an amazing guy.
Product manager / data scientist / engineer /
awesome cyclist,
amazing
dad.
human being.
Yeah, just cool guy. So I went to him and talked to I talked to Alhan about this. So I'm going to read some of what he says, summarize some of what he says, and then that'll give you kind of the reasoning behind this. But it's points out some really cool stuff. It's going to allow us to have a conversation on the crossover of aerobic training on different zones and anaerobic training as well, and how it all relates to each other. So Alhan says, to create the initial relationships, we did an initial analysis to answer the question, if an athlete can pass a level of Y zone, level Y workout of a certain zone, then what level can they pass in another zone? Is there a relationship? In other words, is what they were trying to find. And then we brought in a bunch of additional data to validate, make adjustments, and a lot of work has gone into this. And this is also something that is very much open to constant improvement. As we recognize new relationships and as new information comes through, then this is something that improves, which is really exciting. So from a simple explanation from Alhan, he says, every zone affects what we seem to feel, or what right now what the data is showing, about 2 to 3 zones roughly by varying degrees. For example, when you reach a level 5 in threshold, you might get bumped up to like a level 2 in VO2 max because there is some amount of crossover there. 3.45 in sweet spot might mean that you get some sort of an increase in tempo and endurance as well. So these are just like examples, right? This doesn't mean that you can't achieve much higher levels in those zones. It's simply a minimum that we're very confident that you can achieve. And he says, we do this so that your other zones are closer to your actual capacities, even if you're not actively doing workouts in those zones, because that way, when you drop back in and do your workout, it's not like it's going to be too easy for you. You're going to drop back in and it's going to be something that's more productive for you as you're going through it. Yeah. The right workout at the right time, right? That's the whole thing. So it's really cool. And it's exciting stuff to be able to see. And you will notice that when you do a certain workout, it goes up. But this brings up like the whole premise. And I want to talk about this from like a training philosophy perspective. There's kind of like this perspective that if you do workouts in one zone, you get good at that one zone. And to a certain extent, that is true. But there is crossover, right, Amber? Like it's not like so purely locked into a box.
Right. Our physiologies are not that specific.
If only. If only. Yeah.
Right.
It would be amazing if we could.
Exactly. And I think the crux here from a physiologic perspective is the work that you do in a specific training zone, like let's say threshold, for example, that is going to stress your body and your aerobic system in a very specific way that is going to elicit specific adaptations according to that stress. Those adaptations might look like higher mitochondrial efficiency. It might look like better circulation. Those adaptations are going to increase your capacity in endurance training zone. It's going to increase potentially your capacity in your sweet spot zone as well, because these are not, we like to train these zones because each one has particular adaptations associated with it, but those adaptations aren't necessarily only going to benefit that zone. They will have benefits to other zones too. And that's one of the benefits that we get to leverage here at TrainerRoad, is this massive data set and being able to look at that and discover what those relationships are.
Yeah. It's like, it's kind of easy to polarize the debate into like you're a strength athlete that's like purely anaerobic doing like 1 rep max sort of stuff, or you're an aerobic athlete. And that's criticized a lot of the time, but to a certain extent, it's kind of true, right, Hannah? Because even though you're a cyclist that's going to be doing mountain bike races like short track, and then also to be doing something like, Leadville and all these long events, it's all aerobic training. Even the stuff that's anaerobic in intention becomes aerobic as you go throughout it, right?
Yeah. I think exactly what Amber just said makes so much sense to think through this, is how everything you're training is working a bodily system and making certain adaptations. You're increasing capillaries, you're increasing mitochondria. Like these are the concepts that your body knows. Your body doesn't know 300 watts versus 95 watts. It really doesn't. So we have those wattages so that as humans, we can understand where we're training the systems. But those two things they're just to achieve the same goal. They're not independent of each other. And so it's important to understand that these are things that we're breaking down as people, not things that our body necessarily understands. So there's fitness, then there's aerobic and anaerobic, then there's endurance, sweet spot, tempo, under the aerobic. There's all these different ways we can break it down, but they sit under umbrellas. And we have to understand that anaerobic fitness is really small. So most of what we're doing is going to sit under the aerobic umbrella. And so it makes sense that certain things would impact all of those aerobic systems. And so even like Jonathan just said, so even when you're training for a 20-minute race or an 8-hour race, 20 minutes is still an aerobic effort. It is, because you can't be anaerobic that long. And so what you do for one will still impact the other and vice versa.
Yeah. When we talk about anaerobic training, we're typically talking about training anaerobic capacity. It's usually done through repeats and high intensities that you're reaching. And that's driven anaerobically or without oxygen, right? And that goes away really quick, like your ability to be able to do that. The gas tank runs dry really fast. And then you're left with trying to do as much of that as you can aerobically. So it's really like when you're talking about anaerobic training, it's pretty rarely implemented in the cycling side, especially, track racing more often. That's where you'll see that sort of work really being focused on. And they can be great for building neuromuscular power and building coordination and efficiency. It's really, that's why you'll have short sprints in the middle of your endurance workouts. That sort of stuff is pretty common. But really, the main goal is to make you an aerobic athlete. And it's cool because there's so many different ways to go about doing it. When you get closer to your event, when we're talking about specificity, we're talking about training your body to do very specific actions or very specific patterns that you're going to experience on race day. At that point, we've likely built you into the aerobic animal that you are, right, on the bike. So that part has likely been done. And instead, it's about fine tuning. So when you think about your training and you're doing endurance work, your endurance work is likely helping other things. When you're doing VO2 work, it's also helping other things. So that's why you'll see in the base phase that athletes like Hannah on your training plan, you'll have workouts that are harder. It's not just staying perfectly within endurance, because there's a lot of different ways to spur these aerobic adaptations. Mm-hmm. And you want to make sure that you're doing so in ways that if you just do the same thing over and over again, you don't get a good return. So you want to do things in a way that give you the variety for your body to be able to improve.
And because it's fun to do things differently.
Yeah. And training needs to be fun. If it's not, then it starts to fall off. Right. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This has been an awesome podcast. The three of us.
Great questions.
I feel like we had that's probably thank you listeners for submitting wonderful questions to us. That's really what drives this. I appreciate it so much. Go to TrainerRoad.com/podcast and submit those. We had like a good tripod going on here. All three of us. This was good.
Yeah.
We typically don't do three. We typically seem to do even numbers, but this was fantastic. For everybody listening to this, go follow Hannah on Instagram. Our Instagram handles are on here, or we can find them in the podcast description. Go follow TrainerRoad, Amber, myself, connect with all of us. We're excited to talk to you next week. But in between now and next week, one big thing, please share TrainerRoad with your friends. Share this podcast with your friends. That's the biggest thing that you can do to help us. We appreciate it so much. And we look forward to talking to you next week. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.